Good evening, everybody. So tonight we will be looking at the Flint sit-down strike, which is one of the most epic battles in history of people bringing down a giant. If this were a fantasy novel, the Flint sit-downers and their families would be the dragon slayers, taking down the seemingly invincible General Motors. When it was happening, people all around the world, from Argentina to Italy, were following these developments. Today, many of us in the United States have been deprived of this exciting and insightful history. When we look into it, it shouldn't be a surprise why this history has been hidden from us. Up until this point, our classes have looked at many of the major struggles of the working class in the United States during the Great Depression. Thus far, as explosive, dynamic, and bold as these struggles have been, they very much stayed on the level of rebellion against corporate rule over people's lives. But what makes the Flint sit down strike somewhat unique is that it was able to begin to point in a direction of real transformative and revolutionary change. Typically in strikes, workers walk out of their workplaces and picket outside. But this was different. Instead of walking out, the workers simply sat down and refused to leave until their demands were met. We will get much more into this a little bit later, but first let's look at the background of how this situation emerged. So at that time, General Motors was the largest auto manufacturer in the world. While other auto manufacturers lost a good deal of business during the Great Depression, General Motors was actually experiencing a large uptick in sales. When the economy began to spin out of control, GM had slashed prices, cut production of some of the more expensive models, and laid off huge numbers of its workforce, keeping GM on top of the industry. Flint, in particular, was essentially a company town that was basically owned by General Motors. At that time, the political leadership of the city government and General Motors were inseparable. Any workers suspected of organizing were constantly harassed by the police force. In addition, GM had their own private security forces. In the years leading up to the strike, it is estimated that GM invested nearly $1 million in surveillance between 1933 and 1936. They even hired lip reading spies to try and root out any of the workers suspected of talking about organizing. Clearly, General Motors knew that they were sitting on a potentially explosive situation with the workers. But why? Let's look into it. So we can look at some of the personal accounts of the workers that worked at General Motors at the time. So one example is a worker who said, "See, on the line, you either got to keep up or you'd fall to the end of the line. I knew a young fellow that worked down a little ways. Well, he worked through his lunch hour because he was naturally slow, you see. He had to do it. He just had to. He'd eat his sandwich right there and be working just to keep the thing going and to keep his job because there were 5,000 men standing right out there at the gate waiting for his job, you see, coming from Francis Jordan. So people working through their breaks. Does that sound familiar? Another example is that I think it was 10 days in a row that the temperature was 100 degrees or better. Now, in this period, we were talking about there was no ventilation in the plants either. If you were lucky, you could work by a window and get a little breeze through. Otherwise, no ventilation. The temperatures, and in many cases, reached 130, 135 degrees down there. Now, the men, after 3 or 4 days, began to drop from exhaustion, and they couldn't take this. Management expected normal production from these people during this period. And I have seen those men on the motor assembly line fall right there, completely exhausted. And the supervisors and management would not permit that line to be slowed down. They instructed the people to step over the fallen men who was there and continue the operation. And they would get somebody to come and drag that unconscious worker out of there. Now picture that insensitivity, if you can, that the men were ordered to walk over their buddy who was next to them lying on their floor there in order to put that piston in the mortar and continue that. So when we look at the early organizing, the United Auto Workers had slowly and secretly begun to organize at General Motors. It's also important to note that many of the key organizers and leaders of this effort were socialists and revolutionaries, such as Kermit Johnson and his wife, Janora Johnson. And if they realized, the organizers realized that if the union were to make any dent in the automobile industry, it had to go after its larger employer, and it had to do so strategically. So the organizers decided to focus on Fisher Body Plant number 1 in Flint, Michigan, the place where car bodies were produced. People met the Flint workers at their homes and talked to them walking off the job right away. Instead, organizers planned to stop production through a sit-down strike in January of 1937 after the Christmas bonuses had been paid out and a new governor was in power in Michigan. But that plan was derailed on December 30th, 1936, when the workers at the body plant saw critical equipment being dragged onto railroad cars to be sent to other factories. Word was out that the Flint factory was a Union stronghold. Workers gathered for an emergency meeting, then flooded right back into the plant, and the strike was on. So another personal account, looking at the strike. He came home one night. He says, "Don't be surprised if I don't come home one of these nights." And I said, "Well, why?" And he said, "Well, he says, don't tell anybody, but he says, we're fighting to take over, going to take over the plant and make them let us form a union, because he says it's the only way we're going to win. And he said somebody's going to get killed in there. But he says, if I'm one of them, I'm fighting for a good cause." Well, I knew that he was doing that, but he warned me not to. And then when he didn't come home, I wondered and I thought, oh, well, then I heard somebody had called me and said that they had taken over the shop. There was a sit-in and the police were down there and everything. Roland Moon, wife of a striker. So what that meant was General Motors had been taken by surprise. Though it's suspected that workers might strike, they were not expecting or anticipating that the workers would use the new tactic of sitting down or occupying the plant, particularly Fisher Body number 1. This meant that if GM wanted to bring in replacement workers, they would have to deal with the thousands of workers obstructing the operation. So what did it even mean to have some 2,000 workers living together in a plant for 24 hours a day? Life inside the plant was kind of like an experiment in self-governance for a small city. One account described how committees organized recreation, information, classes, a postal service, sanitation. Courts were set up to deal with those who didn't take turn washing dishes or threw rubbish or smoked where it was prohibited or brought in liquor. Their punishment was consisted of extra duties, and the ultimate punishment was expulsion from the plant. So we don't know if anyone was kicked out of the plant, but their threat was there, and a restaurant across the street was the site that prepared 3 meals a day for 2,000 strikers. There were classes in parliamentary procedure, public speaking, and history of the labor movement, kind of similar to what we're doing tonight. And it's also important to note that there is nothing like going through a struggle together that can shake up people's prejudices. And one important breakthrough that occurred could be seen through the situation of a man named Roscoe Van Zant, the lone black worker who participated in the sit-down strike. So at that time in Flint, black and everywhere, basically, black workers faced intense discrimination and segregation on and off the job. They made up a small minority of the total workforce in the auto industry, almost always working in the most dangerous and dirty jobs. When the sit-down strikers saw Mr. Van Zant participating in the strike, the sit-down with them, a number of them were surprised that he would even consider joining up with them. Initially, when food arrived, he would take it and eat alone in his corner, given the intense segregation of everyday life. On the first evening, there was only one blanket and one open table to get off the cold factory floor. And all of the strikers voted to give them to Mr. Van Zant, given that he was an older man. It's also important to notice that as time went on, the white workers and Van Zant got to know each other in a way that hadn't been possible up until that point, given the suffocating segregation of the society. As time went on, GM tried to freeze out and starve out the strikers, literally. They turned off the heat to the plant in 16-degree weather. So mind you, this is December and January in Flint, Michigan. They also GM sent police in riot gear to attack with tear gas and guns. The striking workers fought back using slingshots made from inner tubes and metal car door hinges, and were able to push the police back. The police blocked food deliveries to the occupiers. So while the men were occupying the factory on the inside, the wives, the girlfriends, the sisters, and the mothers organized themselves on the outside. At first, their role largely was to provide the food for the 2,000 striking men, which in itself was a huge logistical project, as you can imagine. But many of these women were not satisfied with their role in the kitchen and formed what was known as the Women's Auxiliary Brigade, which was led by Janora Johnson. And this organization played an essential role in many of the confrontations, such as breaking the windows of the plant when it was tear gassed to let the air circulate. Soon, the National Guard was brought in with machine guns and pointed them at the workers. But the resoluteness of the strikers was able to talk the soldiers into turning around, many of whom were young teenagers, actually. And to build up support strikes were called in 17 other GM plants in Detroit and even as far away as Oakland, Atlanta, Cleveland, and far beyond. On top of this, there were workers from all over the region that were electrified by the news and flocked to Flint to show their support. What this effectively meant was that many workplaces were effectively shut down in a de facto strike wave, which put even more pressure on GM to settle and recognize the union. But despite all of this, it wasn't enough to bring GM to the table. Time went on, and workers felt that it was more and more necessary to escalate their actions, even more to put more pressure on General Motors. Kermit Johnson, who was a known socialist and also someone elected to the strike committee, devised a plan. The plan was to shut down and occupy GM engine plant number 4, which was heavily guarded at that time. To draw the guards away, they devised a plan to call for a mock strike, a fake strike at plant number 9. And they correctly assumed that there was a snitch within their midst that would convey this false plan back to the company. The call was so convincing that even the workers at plant number 9 believed that it was true, and they enthusiastically responded to the strike call, even though it brought about beatings and tear gas from the guards. Fortunately, there were members of the Women's Auxiliary Brigade present to break the windows and clear out the tear gas. But ultimately, the diversion tactic worked. GM engine plant number 4 was the real target all along and was left unguarded long enough that workers could march into it and seize it. This was the critical and ultimate choke point in GM's production system that forced them to the bargaining table that they had been resisting up until that point. After 44 days of strike, GM was forced to sign a contract with the UAW. When victory was declared, the strikers voted to have Roscoe Van Zant, the only black worker, to lead the march carrying the flag. Looking forward, what was the legacy? What did the workers win? Well, on paper, they won a 5% raise and the right to discuss having a union during the breaks. This was important because that meant that led to the explosive growth of the United Automobile Workers, which recruited hundreds of thousands of GM workers. Following the strike, there were also important blows against racial discrimination, opening up positions for black workers that had been previously denied to them. Perhaps most importantly, the workers won a newfound sense of power on and off the job. People were able to hold their heads up high in a way that they weren't always able to do before the strike. The people of Flint had gone through an experience that challenged many of the assumptions of everyday life. Workers challenged the claim of corporations to control the means of production. Women did far more than simply aiding the strikers. They took to the streets as an emergency response team when the situation demanded it of them. And the inspiration of the victory had ripple effects far beyond Flint. So in that year, the year of 1937, there was an explosion of 477 sit-down strikes throughout the United States, involving workers from just about every industry imaginable. The numbers of workers joining and building their own unions from the ground up exploded as well. The message was clear that if the workers in Flint could take down the dragon of General Motors, then anything was possible. So in conclusion, as we wrap up this presentation, I'd like to end on a point that was raised earlier, the revolutionary potential of what the strike represented to build a different world. It is certainly true that the immediate demands of the strikers were not inherently revolutionary, like the struggles preceding them, recognition of the union, improved wages and working conditions, and etc. But that doesn't tell the whole story. By utilizing the tactic of workers occupying and sitting in the factories, it called into question the sacred logic of capitalism, that employers had exclusive control to their property. In this case, the plants. It immediately calls into question who controls the productive wealth of this society. In fact, it is the labor of the workers that built the property that the bosses claimed as their own. But for those 44 days back in 1936 and 37, the workers were able to take it back. And hopefully one day, we will take back all of the wealth of this society that rightfully belongs to all of humanity. Thank you.